Hello and welcome to our continuing saga of the Vietnam War. We finally finished JFK last week, and I know it seems like we talked about him with regard to Vietnam longer than he was actually in office dealing with Vietnam, but we're finally done with that. And we get to move forward and on and above today. One correction, outline number 25 from last class, at the end of last class, somehow got lost. Gremlins invaded my computer webpage. And so I need to fix it, which means I'm going to have to watch the tape from last week and figure out what was on it because I didn't keep a hard copy, which is what everybody told me to do. So at any rate, it will be back up soon. So today, and that brought us up to the Kennedy funeral, the ZM coup and the Kennedy assassination. So today we're going to pick up from there, talk about the aftermath of the coup, first in Vietnam, and then show how the Americans dealt with that the situation that emerges out of the coup. Southern Vietnam, RVN, Vietnam below the 17th parallel, is in a crisis situation in 1963. ZM's continuing problems with the United States. ZM and his brother Nu are continuing to have problems with the U.S. In fact, ZM and Nu are reluctant to give the United States too much power. They don't want too great a U.S. role in Vietnam. In addition to that, they're making overtures to the National Liberation Front, and of course, most publicly, you have the Buddhist repression and this growing civil conflict with the Buddhists, which is best demonstrated, of course, by the famous immolation of Buddhist bonzes, the first one in June of 1963, and then thereafter, which really bring Vietnam to the public attention in a huge way for the first time. And this creates new problems in Vietnam, and the coup creates a new set, excuse me again, of crises. Now, it's popular among many people who were in the Kennedy or Johnson administrations to kind of look back and see the ZM coup as a turning point. I think that's a bit overstated. Their basic line is, we should have stayed with ZM. It was stability and whatnot, and because look what follows, as we'll find out later. But clearly, the ZM regime had no popular backing, and the Buddhist situation really exacerbated it. And keep in mind too, it's not the Viet Cong that gets rid of Ngo Dinh Diem. I mean, the Viet Cong have an interest in maintaining Ngo Dinh Diem in power. They were not overjoyed, as we'll see, by the coup because Diem in many ways was one of their best buddies. He was really working, obviously not consciously, but he was working in their interest because the situation in the South was very unstable, and the Viet Cong, the front, was able to exploit that. Ngo Dinh Diem is overthrown by his own people, by his own military, with the consent and some support from the U.S. Embassy. Henry Cabot Lodge, the new ambassador there, wanted to see ZM go. So keep that in mind. I mean, as we look back, and people talk about, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong and everything like that, the instability in the South was not fomented by the NLF. The NLF exploited an internal situation, and they did so very effectively. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the aftermath of the coup and then how both sides respond to it. The most salient characteristic, I think, is chaos. And at various points, we'll touch upon different aspects of this. I'm just going to mention it now. But in the South, below the 17th parallel, the coup does not bring stability. The elimination of the ZM regime, the actual death of ZM and his brother, bring a new cast of characters to power, but don't really alter the way the war is conducted or politics in the South. The coup occurs in November of 1963. Between November of 63 and the early spring, February, March of 1965, which is a period of, 16 months, the RVN, South Vietnam, sees a succession of over a dozen, perhaps 18 governments, and the reason I don't give you a precise figure, I'll get to it, is that, there's such a revolving door that one really doesn't know whether to include somebody as a president or not, or a prime minister or not. So there's a revolving door, there's total government instability. I mean, in one particular week, you had about 3 or 4 shifts in government. You have people coming back and forth, in and out of power. It's really fairly chaotic. The United States takes an even more active role than it did during the ZM coup, a far more active role in this period. putting people in power basically from the Pentagon, helping remove people from power basically from the Pentagon. So the U.S. gets even more deeply involved. I spent last week telling you how deeply involved Kennedy had become and how this essentially had become Kennedy's war. It becomes even more so. I mean, the ZM coup, the U.S. clearly has a role in it, but it's a creation of the ARVN. It's a creation of ARVN officers who were tired of the No family. Subsequent overthrows of government and subsequent changes in government are clearly creations of Americans and American policymakers. The best book on this is actually a book called Intervention by George McT. Cahan, who's really a very well-known scholar and an outstanding scholar on Vietnam. And Cahan's book really details the machinations and the collaborations, if you want to use the term conspiracies, probably okay, between American defense officials and the Vietnamese, or the Southern Vietnamese. You know, who's in, who's out. The U.S. Really begins to play a far more overwhelming role in Vietnamese politics after the coup. So in the South, then, you have a revolving door of governments and fairly constant instability, which is going to lead to more public protests, more Buddhist protests, no effective government of any kind at all for about 18 months after the 1963 coup. Stability finally comes around 1965 and really until the end of the war, when governments led by the same two men remain in power, Nguyen Van Thu and Nguyen Cao Ky. Now, there's stability in the sense that it's the same individuals. You don't have this revolving door. In terms of effective leadership, it's not terribly different than anything that preceded it. But clearly then, from the coup until early February, when the U.S. essentially really takes over the war and Americanizes it, it's total chaos in the South. And you can't forget this. You have to keep this at the forefront at all times. I mean, the United States is there to save this country below the 17th parallel. And it's very difficult to save a country that has 18 governments or 12 governments in 18 months, or however many you want to count. It would be like a doctor trying to cure lung cancer in a patient who continues smoking 2 or 3 packs a day. You're fighting an uphill battle, to put it mildly. So clearly chaos in the South. That's an organizing. That's a salient characteristic. How does the enemy respond to the coup? Well, they gain from it. Even though the front, the NLF, the Viet Cong really didn't have any interest in seeing No Dinh Diem overthrown, because they were doing quite well exploiting his own repression and the division he was causing in Southern society. The front gained out of the continuing instability. And one thing I want to do is go back and talk a little bit about the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, because I mentioned that they had been established in December of 1960, and then we launched off into a discussion and examination of what Kennedy did. So I want to go back and talk a little bit more about the National Liberation Front. I think it's important because until the early 1970s, the front, the Viet Cong, really formed the basis, the overwhelming basis of the war in Vietnam. The enemy consists essentially of you can say either 2 or 3 groups. The NLF, which is the political group opposed to first the ZM regime and later subsequent regimes, has a military wing called the Viet Cong, the VC. And the United States also has to confront the conventional army of North Vietnam, the PAVN, which is a traditional army. Okay, and this is in the DRVN, the northern Vietnam. So the United States, there are 2 layers of enemies that it has to confront, and the PAVN really doesn't become a major force until long after the Tet Offensive, when the war does take on a bit more conventional characteristic. But I would argue that you really don't see a PAVN takeover until very late. I would suggest the Easter Offensive in 1972, which we'll get to down the road. But before then, the Viet Cong, which has its own ups and downs, which we'll see, especially after Tet, really is the dominant force in the insurgency, in the movement against the government in southern Vietnam, if you want to call it a government. In addition to that, there's question as to what the Viet Cong was. Was it an indigenous group in the South, or were they Northerners who were coming in to fight the war in the South. For the several years after the establishment of the NLF, up to Tet, I would say again, the Viet Cong essentially, for the most part, were a Southern group. Through recruitment, through sometimes coercion, the Viet Cong often gained recruits in the South. Now, there are Northerners infiltrating into the South to fight with the Viet Cong. The numbers are not that great until after Tet, and actually the common conception that Tet really decimates the VC is really off. It's actually subsequent activities in 1968 to do that. So what you have, I think, especially in this period, the early 60s up to 1965, is clearly an insurgency fought essentially by the Viet Cong, the NLF, with only limited PAVN influence. So there's a major battle in late 1965, Ia Drang Valley, where you see the PAVN come in, and you have some skirmishes and things like that. But up to, you know, in the initial years of the war, it's a war fought essentially in the South by Viet Cong, who for the most part were Southern themselves. Okay? I think a question. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the Viet Cong. Remember the VC, the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. The Viet Cong is essentially an offshoot of the old Viet Minh, and I think I mentioned this before. Viet Cong is actually an insult that Diem devises of Vietnamese communists. It's a slur, and it becomes adopted, of course, by the United States and the press because it's a way of identifying them as communists. And pretty soon they start using it themselves just because it's easier and everybody else is using it. So that's where the name comes from. The NLF, the Viet Cong, was established, remember, in December of 1960, and that elevated what was principally or solely a political struggle to the military level. The initial group, the initial military group in the South was actually called the PLAF, the People's Liberation Armed Forces. And this is the genesis of what becomes the Viet Cong. The PLAF is essentially the VC. Now the Northerners, sometimes to avoid the appellation VC, will keep referring to that as the PLAF. I'll talk a little bit about the way it's set up because it's interesting, again, to show how the Vietnamese perception of People's War differs from the way the United States is fighting, the way the Southern Vietnamese are fighting in Vietnam. The PLF is organized at 3 levels, and this is based on their concept of People's War. First, you have local or self-defense forces. Okay, so you have local or self-defense forces. These are kind of the most broadly based or general warriors in the Viet Cong and the PLAF. These are the kind of mythical farmers by day and fighters by night. In the United States, there was always talk of, you know, somebody who worked the rice paddy all day and then at night puts on the black pajamas and becomes a VC. These are the local self-defense forces. They're part-time warriors. They don't have a lot of training. They're not terribly well armed, and their major goal is to defend the villages where they live. So they're local forces, self-defense forces. They defend their home villages, and they're fairly rudimentary in terms of their military skills and equipment. And it's real hard to come up with numbers for any of these. So at this point, I'm not going to do it unless I have. You know, of course, the U.S. military's own reports often indicates enemy strength, and those tend to be, I think, fairly useful, fairly close. So, but the numbers are very difficult no matter what. And of course, in this group, and later on after Tet, we'll talk a little bit about there was a major controversy involving William Westmoreland and Westmoreland's failure to notice this infiltration into the South before Tet, which leads to the Tet offensive. And one of Westmoreland's defenses is going to be that these people, local self-defense type fighters, should not be included in the enemy's order of battle. Many of them aren't even armed. I mean, they're people who generally support the VC. They may give them rice or give them a place to stay. So this is a real squirrely category. Clearly the numbers are very large. They're probably larger than any other number because almost anyone can be included in it. I mean, a 70-year-old woman can be a member of the local self-defense corps, you know, or a child, whereas they're probably not likely to be in other groups. So the lowest level, or the most basic level, is this local self-defense corps. Then a second level is guerrilla forces. Yeah.
Dr. Brzonko, because of the indigenous nature of the local self-defense forces and the fact that they are the people, the population, which is giving aid and relief and assistance almost without, number. Would you say that that was a major factor in the ability of the Viet Cong to eventually prevail?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, clearly you need fighters, but it's just as important to have loyal villagers or trustworthy villagers, people who either because they choose to do so or they're intimidated to do so, will let you hide out or will feed you or will support you or will cause the government trouble. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a big category. And there was always a controversy as to what should be included in the order of battle in the enemy OB. And it was mainly over this local self-defense group, but I mean they're clearly vital. I mean, if you want to, well, Napoleon, as I said, Napoleon and Mao Zedong essentially agree. Napoleon said most of warfare is morale. It's the morale aspect of it, and clearly it's important. If you have the support of the villagers, then that improves morale. And Mao's famous axiom regarding the people, the people are to warriors like water is to fish, to guerrillas. Guerrillas can't survive. Just as fish can't survive without water, guerrillas can't survive without the support of the people. And so these local self-defense corps are really, really terribly important. They're not terribly well armed, and the type of activity is generally, fairly limited. They protect their villages.
A good cover then.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, northern and southern Vietnamese don't look different. So, it was kind of funny because you always, not always, but quite often you would see a document in which an American would say, why do their Vietnamese fight so much better than our Vietnamese? They're all Vietnamese, right? So the first group is the local citizens. The second grouping that the VC establishes is the guerrilla forces who are organized at more of a regional level. Now these are full-time guerrillas. They're fighters. They're better armed than the self-defense forces, quite often armed with American M14s and M16s, in fact, that they either get off the black market or take away from the ARVN. And they are under a district command. The self-defense forces don't have a whole lot of a centralized authority. The guerrilla forces are under the command of there's a district commander. So this is a military grouping, clearly. And the guerrilla forces are probably the best known. I mean, these are the smaller units which will mortar Benoit or Da Nang, and they will attack an American battalion on maneuvers or, blow up a power plant, that kind of thing. And the third level in the VC is main force units. The best of the regional guerrillas tend to be promoted into the main force units. There they are organized into battalions, much larger installations, much larger units, and they are under the direct command of something called the COSVN, which is the Central Office for South Vietnam. And this is the overall command structure that the front has in the South. Central Office, South Vietnam, COSVN, is the Pentagon. I say that with a smile because later on this will come into play when Nixon invades Cambodia. He claims to be going after COSVN, and COSVN is headquartered in Cambodia. So the COSVN is the Central Office of South Vietnam. This is kind of the central command for the insurgency in the South, and the main force guerrillas are under the direct command of COSVN. So, beginning in 1960, and then from that year forward, the Viet Cong, the PLAF, the National Liberation Front, the Viet Minh, call them whatever you want, are shifting more toward relying on military force than political force as they were before. But even though, as they put it, the path to violence is now very important, it's now the key, political struggle remains more important. So even though they have now taken up armed struggle, the front continues to insist that the main theater of this insurgency is political rather than military. Why do they do this? They have to be careful. And again, Ho Chi Minh has a sense, as always, of the larger world around him. Ho is afraid, Le Duan, Van Nguyen Giap, the Southern Viet Cong commanders. And I'm still, I'm not avoiding the question of command and control with regard to the North and South. COSVN, when it's established, has a good deal of autonomy and does so for the next few years. As the war goes on, the Politburo in Hanoi will exert more and more influence over COSVN. And now people are getting into the Vietnamese records and finding out more about it. And hopefully down the road we'll have a better understanding of the relationship between Hanoi and the insurgency in the South. So far, based on the work of people like Dwiker and Dave Marr and others, it does seem like the South does have a good deal of autonomy, and Southerners are making decisions for themselves in this period, and perhaps again up until Tet. And after that, you see greater Northern influence over Southern military strategy. Okay, but going back a bit, why continue to have political struggle as your number one goal? Ho understands that if he pushes too far, too fast, if he emphasizes armed struggle and tries for a very quick and overwhelming victory against the RVN, which may be feasible because the RVN is really in constant series of crises, then both his enemy and allies probably won't tolerate it. He's afraid that the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China might be upset if he, or not necessarily be upset, but might try to question Ho Chi Minh's activities if he prefers armed struggle, if he does too much of that too soon, because they're afraid that the war in Indochina could widen, and the Chinese don't want to deal with that. It's on their border, and the Soviet Union doesn't want to deal with it either. So Ho has to be careful that he doesn't alienate his allies by going too soon, doing too much too soon. And even more importantly, Ho doesn't want to alienate or provoke the United States from taking a larger role in the war. If Ho tries to do too much too soon, if the VC goes for kind of a quick victory, then it's more likely to draw the Americans in. So Ho wants to kind of hopefully get the war slowly, and by the time the U.S. realizes it, it's too late. Okay, that's his goal. Another reason that they continue to emphasize political strategy before November 1963 at least is their essential contempt and disrespect for Diem and Nhu, for the No regime. They believe, and it's probably an accurate assumption, that if the U.S. stays out of the war, then they can take over without any large-scale use of force, that the South will implode, the South will defeat itself. It will self-destroy, and they can just kind of walk in and assume this vacuum of power. And so they don't want to provoke either the U.S. from intervening, they don't want to make their allies uneasy and possibly get involved in Indochina in a greater way, and they want to let the South, the Diem regime at first, just kind of take care of itself and perhaps win the war without major bloodshed. So this is their operating assumption in the first years of the insurgency. Viet Cong here is just a photo of a VC soldier. It's nothing, terribly exciting.
Question?
Yeah.
Was it understood that the VC, if they had, won their struggle, that they would fall under Ho? It was understood that the country would be unified under Ho?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't it be? And, Ho believed that he had credibility to do so. American reports are still assuming that Ho wins any election easily. Despite problems in the North, there was no real sign that Ho's, power certainly wasn't diminishing, and nor really was his popularity. So, yeah, I mean, I think the VC were fine with that. Reunification always meant communist leadership. That's pretty clear from the get-go. Now, whether it would be as part of a front or the party itself was in flux, and the longer the war goes on, the more influence the party exerts over the front. But again, I would say that's fairly late. I mean, one of the tragedies, I was telling Ron earlier, and this is ahistorical, it's counterfactual, but if the U.S. doesn't intervene en masse, or it doesn't support ZM before that, and the war or the insurgency ends with reunification in 1960 or 1964, whatever, you've avoided, over a decade of brutal, bloody hatred and anger. And the history of Vietnam is much different. That doesn't mean it would have been, joy and light and flowers and little children singing, but clearly you have a much different outcome. But by 1975, there's just such bitterness and blood and acrimony and hatred that, the situation changes.
That bitterness that you referred to would be between those of who support the North as opposed to those who support the South.
Yeah,
we're talking
absolutely.
about Vietnamese bitterness towards Vietnamese.
Yeah. I mean, once wars end, it's payback time. I mean, the American War for Independence, they confiscated British, Tory property and put people in jail and things like that. So, yeah, it's a sad fact of human nature. People tend to exact revenge at the end of long conflicts, personally and politically. I mean, I think Ho would have hoped to avoid that. And by letting, and that was the beauty, if the U.S. doesn't intervene and ZM falls apart, then this is fairly bloodless. Not necessarily totally, but it's fairly bloodless. It's limited. They can take over, and you don't have massive tasks of reconstruction, and not a lot of people have been damaged. Farms and families haven't been wiped out. And, it's easier, if nothing else, to try to bring the country together again. By 1975, bombs and death and millions dead and villages and devastated, and it's just, the hatred is much deeper by that time. Okay. So this is the organization of the Viet Cong. At the same time, and this even above, or well, I don't want to say above or below, those are bad adjectives. At a different level from these forces, these three levels that I mentioned, are groups of Vietnamese who support the movement, support the front, support the revolution. Gabriel Kolko, who writes some wonderful stuff on Vietnam, often refers to the movement in the South as a single noun, the revolution, and that's actually fairly useful. And by revolution, he doesn't necessarily mean the act, but in fact the people who are in it. He lumps them all together. The people who support the insurgency and the activity in which they're engaging constitute the revolution. So the revolution is everybody. It's people and activities as well. In addition then to this military organization that supports the revolution, you have many, perhaps millions of Southerners who support the revolution in a different way. They're not soldiers, but they belong to a number of mass organizations. Okay? Mass organizations are liberation associations. They're extra official, I mean, how do you define this? We're dealing with an insurgency and groups associated with it. So it's real hard to find precise words. The mass organizations they're not military groups. They're not necessarily political groups. They're political groups, but they're not necessarily VC groups. The National Liberation Front, remember, is the vehicle for liberation, and the NLF established is essentially has kind of a pyramid structure. And so the NLF, let's say this is the NLF, you have different levels, central authority, provincial authority, district, and then local, of course. This would be like, let's say Cosvin, and this would be the village, district, and province, right? And those would comprise the forces we just talked about. But at the base, much larger, by far the largest amount of NLF support comes from mass organizations. They are not military groups, they're liberation associations. I mean, that's a really good way to describe it, liberation associations or liberation organizations. They're peasants, they're workers, they're writers, artists, lawyers. They can be based on occupation, they can be based on gender, they can be based on age. They can be based on religion or ethnicity. They are, in the American political system, you would call them constituent groups or blocks. And you have Irish in Boston and Poles in Chicago and Italians in the Northeast. This is not a terribly good example, but it's not that unsimilar. The largest of these mass organizations was the Farmers Liberation Association. These are Southern groups, too. Keep that in mind. The NLF claimed that the Farmers Liberation Association had 1.8 million members by 1963. They're not VC. The vast majority are not armed. All right? They support the revolution, though, the Farmers Liberation Association. The NLF, taking a cue, Ho still understands that the most dynamic issue in Vietnamese society was and remains the issue of property, of land ownership. And the NLF has a program called Land to the Tiller. Okay, and that says it all, land to the tiller. Ho is still advocating that land ownership be given to peasants, people who actually work the land. And so this involves the type of land reform that occurred in the North with some real serious problems in the late 50s to be continued and hopefully, as far as Ho is concerned, refined. The idea of land to the tiller means that you redistribute land, you redistribute wealth, you take land from wealthy landlords and you redistribute it to the peasants. Most of the Farmers Liberation Association's members are very poor landless farmers. Okay, so this is the biggest group. This is a mass organization. They may fight. I mean, it's possible that they would. They may be involved in village defense, but basically they are the political support for the revolution. They want the NLF to win because it might bring them land. I mean, many of them, this is 1963, so 1945 was only 18 years before that. So many of them may remember the initial attempt at land reform after the French very briefly left. They may remember brief attempts at land reform in 1954 after Dien Bien Phu, when Ho briefly, thought he had control of the entire country. So this is a winning issue. It's like the version of it's the economy, stupid. It's land ownership. It's very fundamental. We're dealing with an agricultural society where land and property make one, well, not wealthy. It's not even wealth. It's subsistence. It gives one the ability to live, to survive, and perhaps feed a family. And this is still, remember, a very traditional agricultural society. And it's about to be uprooted because the Americans are going to flood in with beer and air conditioning and telephones and cars and all kinds of stuff like that. Another very important mass organization was the Women's Liberation Association. And this was large and widespread. And the role of women in Vietnam is quite interesting. Remember, Vietnam is a traditional Confucian society. And what does Confucianism stress? Does Confucianism stress change and advancement and progress and equal rights between men and women and all kinds of things like that? Not really. Confucianism is a very traditional society based on deference, and part of that would be the deference of women to men, wives to husbands, and so forth. Ho Chi Minh is willing to adapt Confucianism to fit him, but at the same time he's fairly forward-looking. And women had always had a fairly important role to play in the Vietnamese Revolution, really from the earliest days of the 20th century struggle, from the 1910s and 20s and 30s onward. By no means was there equality. I mean, if you look at the Politburo, it's still going to be male-dominated. The foreign minister for the NLF is a woman, Madam Nguyen Thi Binh. And there are other women, who have positions of influence, but still, by no means a majority. It's still male-dominated. But at the same time, women had a vital role to play in the Vietnamese Revolution. In the First Indochina War, 46 to 54 against the French, women served as spies, as agitprop was a term often used, agitprop. Agitators, provocateurs, agitprop, cadre, transport workers. They would get on a bicycle with 80 pounds of supplies and drive from one area to another. And women did, in fact, fight as guerrillas. So women had a vital role to play in the First Indochina War. Interestingly, and in contrast to the traditional Confucian concepts of male supremacy and paternalism, party documents from the Indochinese Communist Party, from the Liaodong Workers' Party, from the front, often stressed sex issues, gender issues. Men, Viet Minh soldiers, for instance, who were accused and found guilty of sexual crimes, including rape, could be summarily executed. They'd be given the death penalty for a sex crime. Beyond that, party documents stressed a deeper kind of gender equality. One of the documents coming out of the NLF, and in fact they took this, with some level of seriousness, said women are not only equal to men in society, politically, they're also equal to their husbands in the family, personally. We will abolish inequality between husbands and wives as we will abolish polygamy. Family property is common property as opposed to men controlling it unilaterally. Women are equal to men in standing for elections. Women must be free to choose their own professions. Since they carry out the same work as men, women are to receive the same pay as men. Female farmers will be allocated rice fields on the same basis as men. In brief, we plan to liberate all women to be totally free and equal in society and in their families. Now, they didn't follow through on this rhetorically the way that they would have indicated, but at the same time, you really won't imagine a statement like that coming out in the United States about women. Maybe from Women's Liberation Group, but you're still not going to hear that in 1999. So it's actually quite forward-looking, and by no means did they meet those goals, but some gains were made. So the Women's Liberation Association was really quite important, a really major supporter of the revolution in the South, and women. One of the, I think I'll mention it later. One of the, no, actually, it's in my other book. One of the other things. I know that sounded bad. It's one of them. That's the problem when you go freeform. Yeah.
That's one of the problems of being a prolific writer.
No. I didn't mean to come across as being arrogant. I just sometimes forget where I put things, like my foot in my mouth. But one of the important village members was basically an older woman who was kind of a mother figure to soldiers. They're not always fighting in their own villages. Some may be from the north or from other parts of the RVN, more likely. And so each village would have kind of older women who would kind of take these, some of them are very young, and kind of be a mother to them, give them a hot meal, and kind of whatever, to provide them some sense of family. And so women in that regard, and that's a traditional women's role in warfare, but very vital. So the Women's Liberation Association really has an important role to play in that situation in the South. Because of this, because of the support, if you have farmers and women on your side, you're in pretty good shape, because you got a lot. Most people are farmers, and half the population is female, right? So you're in pretty good standing, and there's clearly a more influence there than the No regime has. It's kind of funny, actually. I think it was on the outline that got zapped, but Madame New, ZM's sister-in-law, the stereotypical dragon lady, she's a very beautiful and exotic woman, also had a women's group in the South that she headed. And I remember I showed you that photo last week. I'd show it again, but I think it got zapped, of her showing these other women how to do, how to shoot a gun. She's doing target practice there. So she also tried to kind of co-opt or harness the power and the influence of women for their side, but they weren't able to pull it off as well. Madame New was not of the people, so to speak, with her fine silks and her, high heels and her, she spoke French and traveled in Europe. She was kind of a pre-Imelda Marcos. There is this stereotype, Madame Chang and Madame New and Imelda Marcos, which, very often unfairly thrown at Asian women. And she certainly fit into that. The media often built that up. Phil Oakes wrote a song in which he talks about Madame New, the sweetheart of Dien Bien Phu. So she became kind of a lightning rod for criticism in the American press. And it's always easier to beat up on a woman who is very ostentatious and outgoing. So she got terrible press throughout. And so she wasn't really a representative of women's liberation. It's kind of funny, every now and then you'll read a book which refers to her as a strong feminist, which is because she was showing other women how to use guns. Yeah. Which, as a man, scares me deeply. Fewer guns, especially in the hands of women, right? The calls will be coming in soon, right? Yeah. All you folks out there watching this on TV know I'm kidding. At any rate, because of the support of groups like this, NLF strength and popularity grows, at a pretty progressive and rapid pace, pretty consistent. By late 1961, all right, let me throw some numbers out. And again, I do not vouch for the veracity of these because guessing the number of soldiers is just so difficult. When the front was formed, there were an estimated 12,000 guerrillas. And by this, I mean people fighting with guns, not support. Support's massive. Support's way, way, way bigger than that. But in terms of actual soldiers with guns, you have about 12,000. In less than a year, that number almost doubles. It's in the low 20s probably. All right? Now, in terms of having support, even the ARVN's own intelligence concedes in 1961 that the NLF has probably at least 250,000 followers in the South. So the number of actual guerrillas, it could be 12,000, it could be 25,000. In terms of support, self-defense forces and things like that, people who will give you rice or give you a place to stay, probably around 250,000. In terms of political support, if you figure in things like the Farmers Liberation Association or the Women's Liberation Association, many millions. Now, the key question, of course, is what these people do, the level of support they give. But it's clear then, even as early as 1961, right after the NLF is formed, right after the front is established, that the front is quite popular and probably represents, in one way or another, a majority of the Southern population. One doesn't have to have a gun and shoot at the ARVN to be NLF. One can be a student organizing protest. One can be a farmer who believes in the land to the tiller program. One can be a woman fighting for equality between the sexes and be NLF. One can be a Buddhist opposed to the government and be. I mean, the initial National Liberation Front truly was a front. It had university professors, Buddhists, communists, to be sure, virtually every anti-ZM group, and there were a lot of anti-ZM activists in the South, was a member of the front. And the front does its best to remain a front and continues to do so for a few years and increasingly becomes more communist-oriented up to Tet, although you can still see significant non-communist factions in the insurgency up to that point. Right? Yeah.
Question. Then should we perhaps conceive of the front in its origins, particularly here in the early 60s, as a front that is more socialist and nationalist in nature rather than communist in nature?
Yeah, absolutely.
Philosophically.
Oh, absolutely. Very heavily nationalist, and in fact, I mean, without the nationalist pitch, you couldn't have organized it. Remember in 1954, the U.S. Army intelligence suggested that 80% of the Vietnamese supported Ho Chi Minh, and Eisenhower and everybody else said if there were an election held in '56, Ho would win, about 80%. They conceded that. Yet the Army suggests that 80% of Ho's followers were not communists. Unless there's a radical indoctrination from 54 to 60, I suspect that those 80% who were not communist and supported Ho have not become communists in the meantime. I mean, just because one lives in Vietnam and supports Ho Chi Minh doesn't make one a communist. So without that nationalist appeal, the NLF doesn't have that kind of popularity. I mean, land to the tiller, Yeah, that's a social. I mean, land reform, for better or worse, whether it should be or not, it doesn't matter. For better or worse, that's a socialist concept, to actually redistribute land, take land, and give it to people who don't have it. But for the Vietnamese, it has nothing to do with Karl Marx. I mean, it's a question of being a farmer who doesn't have land. Land to the tiller. That's like the Bolsheviks saying peace, bread, and land. It's like a slave in 1866 going to the Freedmen's Bureau to get 40 acres and a mule. Karl Marx is irrelevant. I mean, it's land. And so, yeah, you or I could look at that and say that's part of a socialist program. But in fact, I mean, it's traditional appeal to an agrarian society. And without that, and without the nationalists, I mean, the Buddhists and the intellectuals join for nationalist reasons. I mean, ZM is not modernizing the country in a way that they approve of. I mean, it's modern in the sense that all this technology is coming in, but it's essentially military technology. The education system is still very elitist. Their kids may be able to go to college, the kids of the elite, but most Vietnamese are eliminated from that. And, we have this weird irony. In almost every society, the children of the elite quite often cause their parents incredible grief. I mean, at Tiananmen Square in China in 1989, who was that marching? Those were the children of the party members. I mean, during the Vietnam period, who's going to the anti-war rallies? It's cabinet members' kids. McNamara's son is bringing friends to sleep at McNamara's house to attend big rallies at the Pentagon, right? So they're having dinner with this guy who they consider, Dr. Evil, right, or Mr. Evil, or whatever it is. So, quite often it backfires, and this was happening in Vietnam. The elite send their kids to school, and their kids end up protesting against the government. They get these ideas about modernization and democracy and things like that. So, and there's really a broad-based movement then. So why then do people join the National Liberation Front? And there are several reasons for it, because there are so many different groups involved in it. Most NLF followers, it's probably safe to say, tended to come from the lower socioeconomic levels of Vietnamese society. And lower economic levels of Vietnamese society, pretty poor. So most are poor peasants. And they believe quite fundamentally, quite simply, that under the current regime, Ngo Dinh Diem, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and the family, with the military, Catholic influence being supported by American dollars, with that current regime, there was really no hope for land reform or for social justice. One American in Vietnam was interviewing villagers. The U.S. was always trying to figure out the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese outside of Hue. And this Vietnamese peasant was discussing why he joined the NLF, why he supported the NLF. And he said he calls the NLF the liberation, just like I say the revolution. The answer that this peasant gave, why do you support the NLF, was the liberation had answers for all the most important problems that we all knew. They had an answer about land reform, which was that they would give land to the poor people, as simple as it gets. They had an answer about high taxes. They said the liberation would spend the taxes only for the people and would collect them without corruption. They also said they would help the poor, and this was something else that made them very popular, because many people in the village were very poor. And that cuts to the heart. You can't get more fundamental than that. Get land away, don't overtax them, no corruption, and help the poor. I mean, for a society that is so overwhelmingly underdeveloped, that's a fairly winning appeal. It's peace, land, and bread. Land to the tiller, right? I mean, keep it simple. And so the NLF becomes especially popular among the lower strata of society, and especially in rural areas. The NLF very consciously favors the poor over the rich. It is unapologetic in conducting a class-based movement. Now, is this socialist? Sure. Why not? Class struggle, right? But, again, it really, for the average Vietnamese, doesn't have any identification to socialism. This is simply a matter of agrarian justice. It's a matter of justice, It's not fair that somebody who collaborates with the French has a big plantation and I'm landless. It's real easy to identify with that. There are levels of underdevelopment there that we don't see here. I mean, Appalachia is well developed compared to most of these areas. So the liberation then speaks at a very basic level, land and taxes and poverty and things like that. So the NLF can go in with this pitch, and even if a villager is dubious whether the NLF can pull this off, he's pretty certain that ZM's not going to do it. So, you know, you have, on one hand, you have the certainty of this continued oppression, and on the other hand, yeah, maybe they're selling you a line, maybe they're a bunch of, you know, nuts, maybe they're full of it, but you never know. I mean, maybe there's a chance. So the NLF is able to use this appeal to become quite popular, and they establish a stronghold in many villages. And throughout this period, remember, you know, as I said, the U.S. is always, again, an exact facsimile of Vietnam. The U.S. is always mapping out, and quite often you'll see, you know, red. Much of the South is in red. 50, 60% of the villages are under VC control or VC influence or whatever. All right. Why is that? Because the VC is able, the NLF is able to make this pitch to them. Now, once the National Liberation Front gets established in a village, and a village, you know, you have, let's say there are villages here, and this village gets red, that means it's under VC control. Once a village is established and acknowledged as being an NLF village, within that village, local village leaders who are NLF leaders will establish a land reform tribunal. It's their own version of the Freedmen's Bureau, which will confiscate lands of the wealthy, they play Robin Hood, and redistribute them to the poor. And there are different levels of the landlords. Landlords can be rich, they can be mid-level, they can be poor. In the same way, peasants are classified as rich peasants, middle-level peasants, poor peasants. There are, at the lower level, laborers, the landless, and so forth. And so there are these different levels then of Vietnamese society, and you're redistributing land. The local groups do this too. This is not coming out of Hanoi or out of Cosvin. This is done at a very local level. Right? And of course, from a political standpoint, this makes huge sense, doesn't it? You are giving self-government at the most basic level to people who should know that area better than anyone else. Okay? Do they carry out vendettas against people who own land who they don't like? Yeah, absolutely. That's what redistribution is. In any social transformation, you're going to have winners and losers. That is inevitable. You know, anytime you try to redistribute something, it means somebody's going to lose something. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game, but somebody's going to have to give something up. And by determining who the winners and losers are, you kind of determine the shape and the nature of your revolution or your transformation or whatever. The NLF clearly wants poorer, and landless peasants to win and wealthier landlords to lose. That is a conscious choice, and they are quite candid and unapologetic about it, right? So, I mean, that's, you know, when you're looking at a social rebellion, that's a good question to ask. You know, who wins, who loses? That says a lot about the way a particular movement is shaping up. And in the case of the National Liberation Front, there's a conscious effort to let peasants win and landlords lose. Quite clearly about that. I think it's striking. This is occurring in the early 60s. What is the major land reform movement in the RVN conducted by the government of South Vietnam in the United States? It's what's happening, the program, remember barbed wire, moats, all that. Strategic hamlets. Compare strategic hamlets to the VC, to the NLF policy of land reform. I mean, my God, you know, you couldn't see a more striking comparison. In the strategic hamlets, which you're uprooting villagers and bringing them to another location where you put bamboo and punji sticks and wire and whatnot, whereas the VC are letting the locals do it on their own. It's you know, the Republicans would like that. It's like school choice. It's like vouchers, right? Local control, right? So it's quite wise from a political standpoint. So many people, the majority of people join the NLF for that very fundamental reason. They have something to gain. They might get some land out of it. Some join it out of a sense of nationalism and patriotism. They see ZM, in many ways unfairly, as a puppet of the United States, because as we know, ZM was trying to break the hold of the U.S. and didn't want the U.S. to get too deeply involved. But nonetheless, he is clearly tainted. I mean, without American money and military equipment, ZM really can't stay in power. And so Vietnamese who have a fierce sense of nationalism and pride, they fought Mongols and Chinese and Japanese and French, now see their country essentially being taken over by the Americans, or they're afraid of that, and so many join the front because they don't like what Diem is doing. They don't consider him truly Vietnamese. Some join out of fear of the VC reprisal. The Viet Cong can attack and execute people, and they're not unwilling to do that. They will execute the local tyrants, large landholders, village chiefs, tax collectors, can be a teacher, could be a minister. I mean, basically, if you are a symbol of the government or you're a symbol against the NLF, you stand a good chance of being knocked off or harassed or intimidated or somehow coerced. So clearly there are some people who support the movement out of fear. There's no question about that. And Douglas Pike, in his book Viet Cong, argues that that's the major way that the VC recruit, through terror, through violence, through force. Again, I think William Dwiker and David Marr and many other studies, including studies done by like the Rand Corporation, have shown otherwise. That the majority, the vast majority, in fact, join the front by choice. Because the VC is speaking to issues like land that are important to them. What happens once you join the front? This is when more methods we might associate more with communists come into play. You're trained. You initially get your training, right? Now, to join the front, to join the VC, you get military training. But if you join the front, you get political training. You get indoctrination sessions, and they're referred to as Kiam Dao. I mean, in New York, people are paying $100 an hour for this. The NLF, you get it for free. These are called self-criticism or thought reform sessions, Kim Dao. You sit down and you talk about your role in the community as a villager, what the village means to you, what you can do, what you've done in the past, whether you've done enough, whether you haven't done enough, and so forth. And you sit around and you kind of have, you know, group therapy sessions, but they're based with this political idea. So it's kind of an indoctrination session, no question about that. Initially, you meet, you know, with somebody else one-on-one, and then you have a larger cell of maybe 3, 5, 10 members. And daily, you will get together at some point and have a Kiam Dao session where you will be indoctrinated. You will be trained on what the NLF means. I mean, and the quote I read to you just a few minutes ago is basically Kiam Dao. The liberation will answer our problems. It will, you know, for the question of land, it said it will give land to the poor. It will collect taxes fairly without corruption, you know, and so on and so forth. That's essentially a Kiam Dao. That's an indoctrination lesson. This is what the revolution will do for you. This is what the NLF will do for you. We need you to pass that on. So they're training. It's like, you know, Amway or something like that. You know? The effectiveness of Kiam Dao and the NLF's organization was unquestionable. I mean, you know, even Doug Pike admitted they were highly, terribly effective. Conservatives, like Pike, would argue that it was due to terror and intimidation, but I think, you know, it's more persuasive. And again, Dave Marr and William Dwiker are far from communist apologists. Their work tends to be fairly conservative, actually. And they conclude, as well as many others, including Rand and American officials in Vietnam, that the front, John Paul Vann would agree with this, that the front was nationalistic and it was anti-ZM. And that's a fairly potent combination. So then, by 1963, the front, the Viet Cong, have a great political advantage as ZM imploded amid the overtures to the NLF and the Buddhist crisis. And in fact, as the RVN Buddhist crisis grew, the Viet Cong reduced their level of activity and essentially withdrew. They wanted ZM to bury himself. They wanted self-destruction in the South. They wanted to reduce the level of military activity in armed struggle to let these political battles play out. And in fact, as I said before, the NLF was reluctant to see No Dinh Diem go because he had so effectively alienated so many Southerners and rallied them to his cause. Okay? So ZM was one of the best recruiting tools that the National Liberation Front had. In addition to that, Hanoi, remember, is negotiating with ZM's brother, No Dinh Nhu. And they're thinking maybe we can negotiate something and basically, you know, leave the Americans no choice. You know, if we can cut a deal with Nhu, then the Americans will be shut out. And they can't come in if no one invites them in, right? But the no's are overthrown on November 1st. At that point, We're finally getting to the coup aftermath. At that point, the Viet Cong slows down their activities even more, November 1963, because they want to test out these new leaders in the South. The National Liberation Front, and we'll talk about this later, begins to make overtures to the new regime about a negotiated neutralist settlement. And as we'll see, this gets the new regime in trouble. The United States gives fairly clear-cut orders, no talks with the NLF. And Kennedy, remember, was quite candid about that when they discussed negotiation. We can't negotiate because what would it be? Quote, a major crisis of nerve. Our credibility will be diminished if we come to a negotiated settlement. So the U.S. essentially says, no negotiations. We will not talk to the NLF. We will rebuff their overtures. Okay? So LBJ, as we'll get to, basically decides to continue Kennedy's policies. In Vietnam in December of 1963, the party meets in Hanoi to discuss their prospects. They had hoped throughout 1963 that things in the South, which were terrible, would get so bad that the United States would essentially bail out and let South Vietnam fall on its own. Right? By December of 63, they've given up hope. They now realize, as so long ago prophesied, that the U.S. was in this thing for the long haul. They've given up hope that the U.S. will leave short of being forced out. And this is pretty early, 1963. The party is still very reluctant to expand the role of the North, the DRVN, in the Southern struggle. They don't want to provoke the Americans, an American reaction that might lead to a wider war. They want to keep the U.S. out. Make no mistake about that. I mean, Ho's willing to fight. The Vietnamese are willing to sacrifice. But he's not stupid either. Nobody wants to pick a fight with the biggest superpower and the largest military in the world. And above all, the Vietnamese, the NLF, and Hanoi wanted to avoid that. They don't want to provoke the U.S., and they don't want to strain their relations with Moscow and Beijing by creating a wider war. Remember, China is willing to support Vietnam because it hurts the United States. This does not mean that the Chinese like the Vietnamese. You know, they're ancient enemies, and this is a brief, rapprochement out of convenience, but there's no love lost either. So they will not make this a Northern war or a Pavan war. This will continue to be a Southern NLF, PLAF, VC struggle predominantly. This is in 63, and this is what the party decides in Hanoi. The risks of trying to get a quicker victory with massive Northern involvement are too great, and this will remain a Southern struggle even if it takes longer. So their goal then is to escalate the war in the South, but to be very careful about provoking the United States from entering into it. All right? So this is then what the VC have to face. The situation in the South is deteriorated. They've been able to take advantage of it, but they have to constantly be vigilant that they don't go too far and provoke the United States from coming in. They don't want that. So what's happening then in the U.S.? Right? Lyndon Johnson assumes presidency November 22nd. Johnson is a great politician. Everybody knows that. He was the Senate Majority Leader. He knew everybody and was able to shake people down and smack cans and slap people on the back and divert money one way or the other. He knew everything in Washington. People used to joke, he knew what the janitor at the Senate bathroom made. I mean, he knew everything about Washington and very little about foreign affairs. He was a product of his times. He was a Cold Warrior. He believed in the basic, function of the U.S. was to protect allies against communists, to protect American businesses as they expanded overseas, to protect investments and raw materials, and to keep the forces of freedom, ever vigilant against the totalitarian forces of communism. It was the same ideology that basically everybody had. If you look at the major leaders at the time, Nixon, Kennedy, LBJ, Hubert Humphrey, Scoop Jackson, very little difference there. Ironically, one person who was different was Al Gore's father, Al Gore Sr. In the early 1960s, advocated recognition of the People's Republic of China, Red China. But, I mean, that's unusual. Even McGovern, Church, people who would be associated with the anti-war movement in Vietnam, Fulbright. In 1960, they all basically see the world the same way, in 1963, as LBJ does. So when LBJ takes over, despite, and we'll get to that in a minute, what many Kennedy people say, he essentially assumes Kennedy's policies continues them without much diversion, without much shift. Clearly, when LBJ takes over in late 1963, the situation in Vietnam is quite critical. And the military and political situation in the RVN is in no way promising. Despite that, Johnson chooses not to reevaluate American policy, to even give any thought to changing American policy, de-escalating or withdrawal. That's not even on the board. Despite all these problems, LBJ plows ahead, does not deviate from Kennedy's path. There are already 16,000 military personnel deployed in Vietnam. That number will dramatically rise in the coming years. 1964 to go up to 80,000. By the end of 65, over 200,000. By 66, 67, you're in the 400,000 range. Until late 67, early 68, you have over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. The U.S. has already made, by the time Johnson comes into office, a substantial commitment to Vietnam, and it will grow. Johnson, within a year of taking over, will authorize covert operations against North Vietnam, Op Plan 34A, provoke a crisis in the Gulf of Tonkin, approve a massive bombing campaign, more than one actually, first Flaming Dart in 1964, and then of course Rolling Thunder, the greatest air campaign in military history. He will, within a year, begin to, or at least make plans to introduce ground combat troops into the conflict. By early 1965, less than a year and a half after becoming president, the U.S. is essentially taking over the war in Vietnam. Right? And LBJ does this with constant, clear recognition of the deteriorating conditions in Vietnam. There's never any sense of being misled, despite later what people would say. You know, they were always very clear on what was happening, and he would do it without any real optimism from his own military people about American prospects there. They were very clear-headed. This was a hard-headed decision. It was based on realistic evaluations and realistic appraisals. You know, later on people would say we were lied to, we were too optimistic. That's not the case. People were fairly clear on what the situation looked like, and they went into it with quite open-minded, with a lot of information about that. Okay? Now, Johnson decides to stay the course, and he's very explicit about that. As soon as he takes the oath of office, he says, he writes in his memoirs later, I'd vowed to carry out Kennedy's agenda, and quote, that meant seeing things through in Vietnam. On November 26th, a few days after becoming president, Johnson has a meeting with Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador to Vietnam, with Robert McNamara, and with military officials. And he says, I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went, invoking Truman's loss of China. Later on, LBJ says to his people, you tell those generals in Saigon, the new military group, which we'll talk about in a minute, that Lyndon Johnson intends to stand by our word. Johnson is not giving any kind of a mixed signal. 2 weeks later, in early December of 1963, Dean Rusk sends a cable to Lodge in Saigon saying that Johnson has expressed his deep concern that our effort in Vietnam be stepped up to the highest pitch, and so on and so forth. All right? So the president has made no changes and has not equivocated at all about the situation in Vietnam. Now, what does he do to make this effective or official? On November 26th, he signs off on something called NESAM 273, National Security Action Memorandum number 273. All right? And this is really one of the more discussed and controversial documents of the Vietnam era, and I think without much reason. NESAM 273 was, a restatement, an update of American policy in Vietnam. On November 26, Johnson signs off on NESAM 273, and it says that America's central objective in Vietnam is to take any actions necessary to prevent a communist victory in the South. Quite simply, it just says the United States is in this, and we're going to prevent the communists from taking over the South. All right. NSAM 273 had been in the works for some time. Kennedy's people had been preparing it. And as any one of these things does, if you've ever been in any kind of occupation, the first draft and the last draft don't look exactly alike. And so they had been working on this for several months, and it went through various draft stages. The final draft that LBJ signs off on has different words. It has different verbiage than previous drafts prepared while Kennedy was still alive did. The meaning has not changed a single bit. However, after the fact, a bunch of Kennedy loyalists seized on NSAM 273 and claimed that LBJ changed it to reflect this real aggressive, bellicose attitude toward Vietnam that Kennedy had not intended. James Scott, The War Conspiracy, is probably the best statement on this. James Scott wrote a book called The War Conspiracy, where he's a linguist, I think, and who studied the language of the documents and goes on to suggest that, oh, this was a big conspiracy on LBJ's part to get the U.S. into a war. Noam Chomsky's book, Rethinking Camelot, I think is the best refutation of that. NSAM 273, to me, it's an argument that just really we've wasted too much space on it already. The draft and the final product mean the same thing. There's some different words in it. That's to be expected. But I don't see any persuasive evidence at all that this indicates any kind of shift. This was prepared when Kennedy was president. LBJ's people are Kennedy's people. He doesn't fire everybody on November 23rd. Rusk is still Secretary of State. McNamara is still Secretary of Defense. McGeorge Bundy is still the National Security Advisor. Walt Rostow is still the head of the policy planning staff. William Bundy is still the Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. It's the same team. It's the exact same people. Johnson, had grown up in the same political culture as Kennedy. So, my point is, there's just no change. There's no change whatsoever. So basically, they're all looking. They all have the same ideas. The Americans have the same ideas. They're on the same team in this. We have to do something, right? We have to stay the course in Vietnam, and NSAM 273, basically makes that official. But I don't think it changes anything. So what do? Well, they look around and they see that in the South, the situation is no better. So you have a commitment to preserve and save Vietnam, but at the same time, it's getting worse, both militarily and politically. In December of 1963, Robert McNamara, the head of the CIA, William McCone, and William Bundy, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for Far East Affairs, traveled to Vietnam. They toured there to assess the situation. This is in December 63. And Johnson later says of the report that they came back with, it was gloomy indeed. The Viet Cong, McNamara, McCone, and Bundy reported, were gaining strength and gaining influence over more territory in the South. Communist infiltration was rising, and the Strategic Hamlets program, which is still in effect, was a bust. McNamara says, December 63, quote, current trends, unless reversed in the next 2 or 3 months, will lead to neutralization at best and more likely to a communist-controlled state. He's expecting this to happen by 64. Unless reversed, we're going to have neutralization, which nobody wants, or worse, and more likely a communist-controlled state. This is, and as LBJ said, gloomy indeed. The new government of Duong Van Minh, I'll get to that soon enough, was indecisive and drifting, McNamara said, and it had no concept on how to run the country or how to run the war. Right? So it's a gloomy report. Well, McNamara's report focuses on the situation in the South military, but also politically. And one of his big complaints is that the man who replaces Ngo Dinh Diem is not reliable. His nickname is Big Min. His real name is Duong Van Minh. I couldn't find a photo of him, unfortunately. He's called Big Min because he's about 5'8", which is one of the bigger members of the junta. Duong Van Minh rubs the Americans the wrong way. Why? Big Min and his prime minister, a man named Nguyen Ngoc To, had decided to do what Diem and his brother had done. They talked to the National Liberation Front about establishing, quote, a government of reconciliation. So Big Min makes overtures to the NLF, which Kennedy, remember, has forbade him, which LBJ forbade, Kennedy and LBJ both forbade the SVN, the RVN from doing. You're not allowed to talk to the NLF. We don't want peace breaking out, basically. So Big Min does that, a government of reconciliation, possible reunification. At the same time, Duong Van Min and Nguyen Ngoc Tho refused to allow the Americans to bomb the northern Vietnamese, the DRVN, above the 17th parallel, and forbid the Americans from attacking VC bases in the south. They don't want the Americans to come in and widen the war. This is exactly what Diem and Nhu had done. Throughout December and January of 1964, then, they're looking for ways to get rid of Duong Van Min, and on January 30th, 1964, a coup planned in the Pentagon is staged, and Min is overthrown by Nguyen Khan. This is Washington's coup. This is Washington's leader. Nguyen Khan is a general, and he is placed in power, right? In late January, January 30th, 1964. There's a new government in Vietnam. As of that date, and placed by the United States, far more direct intervention in the coup than there had been in the one in December. So the U.S. doesn't like Big Min because he's made overtures to the NLF, just as they didn't like Diem and Nhu for doing that. And so they have a new government. And we'll pick that up soon.